Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Property Trio, the podcast for the sophisticated property buyer. How's that for an intro, guys?
You did
I
good.
nailed it, Mike.
I'm on brand.
You should host this every week.
I think it's the first time I've done a proper intro there, but it's a special occasion because today we've got a listener question, and I know you guys love those. This particular one, there's a bit in it, so I'm really excited to hear you guys put the grey matter over this. James says, my fiancée, 27, and myself, 30, purchased our long-term owner-occupier house in southeast Melbourne suburbs of Keysborough for $950, a bit over a year and a half ago, with saving up for a wedding, congratulations, holidays, and eventually children. They're hoping to have 2 little rugrats on the horizon within 5 years. They're asking the question, at what stage is it best to consider an investment property? So the specifics of their property purchase in Keysborough was they used a 10% deposit with a variable rate mortgage and an offset. There's approximately $820K still owing, and they borrowed very close to their $900,000 limit. They have a steady yearly combined pre-tax income of about $230 to $250K. So James's question is, do we consider investing prior to children or when we have had all the kids we want and we're back to the double incomes? How much of our principal place of residence loan should be paid off prior to considering investment properties? And should the deposit for an investment property be equity release from that property or through savings from our existing offset account? James says, great show as always. Keep up the good work. So
thanks, James. Great question.
It's a beauty. And that detail really helps as well. Not just, what do I do next, but these are my future plans. And as Dave says a lot of the time, it is not just lines on a spreadsheet. It is your life. It is what you want to achieve in life. And children don't necessarily have a balance sheet value. And if they did, it would be negative. But thankfully, that's not how we rate children in our lives.
Plus dollar liability.
Yes. So maybe we zero in on the first part. With saving for a wedding, holidays, and the children on the horizon within 5 years, at what stage is it best to consider an investment property? Do they get it done early, or do they wait to have all of that stuff and then do it on the back end?
Well, I could see, Kate was wanting to jump and say something there, and but look, I'll go first this time. But I don't mind though. Look, there isn't a black and white answer basically to this question, because it does come down to. And I'll get more specific and talk to their situation. So I won't just give that black and white, sit on the fence answer. But it does come down to your risk profile. And ultimately, the two key drivers around that is how much do you want to have in surplus cash flow after you settle on that investment property? And how much are you comfortable with as a savings buffer after you settle on that investment property? And that is mindful of what your incomes will reduce to. So generally, one person will have to take some time off work post having a child, and then one person might take full time off work, or they may come back part time. So you've got to actually map these numbers out. You've got to understand, okay, what's my income looking like? Who's going to take the time off work? For how long will that be? How long? What is our income growth trajectory likely to be over those years? So what are the kids actually going to be costing you? So you can look this information up, but you need to do the numbers basically, and then understand. Okay. You might look at and go, all right, well, I'm comfortable as long as I have $50,000 in the bank. Okay. And, for a lot of first time investors, that's a buffer that a lot of people are comfortable with.
Yep.
from our experience. Now, you might feel more comfortable with 75. You might be willing to push it tighter and only have $20,000 or $30,000. I think $50,000 is a reasonable number, and you've got to. We'll always sort of try and marry that up to the level of debt someone has. Okay, so these guys have about 800,000 of debt. All right. Now, the other part of the equation is what's actually affordable. Now, they're on high incomes proportionately, I would say. So, their combined income is $230,000 to $250,000, and their debt is about $800,000. So you can often borrow like 6 or 7 times your income. So that's more like talking 1, 2, 1, 3, 1, 5, 1, 6 for these guys. They're only borrowing about half that top end that they might be able to borrow up to. So I suspect they've got a fair bit of borrowing capacity, but that's going to change once they have kids.
And that's,
right.
Kate, where it sort of gets into the timing, right? Because,
Yeah.
I mean, on paper, it's like, okay, we've got the salaries, we go and have the kids, we go back to the salaries, but we don't necessarily know how achievable that is for the family. Maybe one of them goes back to part-time work. Maybe there are some other costs that we haven't figured out. And what we don't necessarily have is, their spending behaviours. Well, how much are they able to save per week, right?
Yeah, they've mentioned a couple of things here. So obviously, holiday, they might be talking about honeymoon or a big time holiday, a wedding. So they know those costs. They can count on those. A little side note, and weddings are a very personal thing for people, but I had a sub $500 wedding, and it was awesome because I could put the otherwise lavish wedding money into property, and I wouldn't have that any other way. But that's not for everyone. Looking at what they've already achieved, they've purchased about a year and a half ago in Keysborough. Now, if I was buying a family home or a substantial home that would be suitable for me and children in Melbourne, that was integrated with amenity and all of the things that you want in the southeast, I think they've chosen really well. Keysy is a great spot. It's gentrifying or gentrified, and I think well done. Certainly want to make that clear. They've already got the big rock in the jar. But this question that they've asked about, when should we think about an investment property, it comes down to risk profile as well, because we can work out what the wedding and the holiday will cost. We can't work out exactly what children will cost because A, we don't know when they'll arrive. B, we don't know how costly each child could be. It comes down to health, special needs, education, all of those things. And what we don't know here in this picture is what sort of support they'll have with childcare, whether they want to take part-time or full-time off work, whether they've got parents that can be hands-on, how close in age the kids will be. So there's a few things that no one can predict. And that's the toughest bit. So do you jump in now and get an investment property based on best guess and some buffers and create a situation where you're essentially dealing with forced savings? You're locking yourself into something. But the positive is you're getting in earlier, because the longer you hold an investment property, the better the wealth position is as well. So grappling that does come down to risk profile and getting as much visibility as you possibly can. And, to that latter point, it's not a perfect science.
The timing is and that's a great insight, Kate. The timing is really important, right? Because we've got two things. We've got the time in the market, if they're getting in now, but they've also got those two salaries. And, I love the idea of kind of, gaming the banks. Oh yeah, we've got about 230, 250K, and then you get the loan and then, oh, bam, we're down to a single income and the banks just have to deal with it. Does that come up a lot with you, Dave?
Yeah, look, it probably need to be careful what I say here.
I can tell by that laugh that that's I need to be careful.
Look, people certainly take license at times, and they're borrowing to invest or buy a home, and one of the two of them's pregnant, and they're aware that incomes are going to reduce, and but they're willing to take that risk because they understand what their circumstances are going to be post that. They understand their buffers, and so they potentially take out liabilities that they potentially cannot afford in theory on paper for a period of 6 to 12 months, but then they'll be able to afford it once more, 12 months later, 18 months later. So look, really, you basically do need to go through a thorough process of mapping out what the likely costs and changes, to your cash flow are, what your financial position is likely to be. I mean, as a general rule, I always say, as soon as you can afford to invest, that's the best time to start investing. But if in a situation like this, and you can't make that decision and not factor in, well, we're spending $50,000 on the wedding. And from what I'm told, nowadays, that's sort of mid-range of a cost for a wedding. You can't ignore the fact you're planning to have 2 kids in the next 5 years and the impact of that. So you should map these things out so you can make an informed decision. Now, like, we can do that thoroughly with our property planning software, but you can do that to a reasonable degree, in a spreadsheet, and really, mapping that out and then marrying it back up with what your risk profile is, which is really your comfort zone around your surplus cash flow and your surplus and your buffer. That should ultimately drive whether you purchase an investment property before or after, and what is the price point of that property.
Yes. And there was a question about, is there a magic amount that should be paid off the principal place of residence before buying an investment property? I mean, Kate, is there an answer to that is outside of just, well, what's your risk appetite?
Yes, there is. It's your runway. What's the length of your runway? Because if you're at work for another 30 years and you're risk averse and you want your debt to be reduced, well, you can have that conversation together. But if your runway is not that long, you'll absolutely miss that chance to get an investment property and enjoy that performance. And I would argue anyone, if they're looking at getting a good investment property for long-term capital growth performance, you want to hold it for more than 20 years. Definitely 10. I don't want to buy an investment property for someone if their short-term view of holding it, if their 10-year plan is less than 10 years. But more than 20, you're getting the rewards of that, and ideally 30. So I think it just comes down to the length of your runway. If you're really risk averse and you're hell-bent on paying down your PPOR, I think it's a false economy, because debt is debt. I mean, we're talking about good debt when it's great property, whether it's your PPOR or your investment property. That's good debt. It's not like you're buying a jet ski, you're buying property. So I would argue, get comfortable with a debt level and stop looking at it as owner-occupied debt and investment debt. Get some good advice around the tax deductibility. I mean, the real answer to this question, the powerful answer, comes from someone like Dave. I understand it, but he does it all day and understands it inside and out.
That's the thing,
Look,
Dave, because we've got tax deductible debt, and then we've got the principal place of residence debt, and they aren't created equal from a tax perspective.
Yeah, look, I'd say once you're in a level to invest financially, irrespective of how much debt you have on the home loan, if you have quite a long runway, as Kate's talking about, then I'd be investing, basically. So, like, whether the debt was still 800,000 or whether it's 700, or, there is no perfect answer. You might be someone with much higher incomes and your home loan debt is 1.5 mil. You don't need to pay that down to 200,000, which might take 20 years or 10 years or whatever before you invest, So, if you can afford to do it, then I would say do it. But like, back to these guys specifically, they're only 27 and 30. They've only got a long runway. They've only got $800,000 of debt. If it did feel like by the time we pay the wedding, go on the holiday, have the first kid, one of the income's reduced. We have the second kid, one of the income's reduced, and it just feels too stressful and like we really could be stretching ourselves and under a lot of pressure. And let me tell you, when you have young kids, you're under a lot of pressure already. When you have multiple young kids in a household, there's challenges. There's challenges you cannot foresee prior to having kids and going through that experience. Like if that process takes them 5 years to have 2 kids, their wedding and a holiday, and they're only 27 and 30, and they can get back to incomes of 250K, and let's say their income's increasing at inflation, the rate of inflation over the next 5 years, that gross income's likely to be 300,000 or so in 5 years' time, and their debt's still only like 800, 750. They're going to have runway to invest and do it comfortably. So I'm not saying that's what they should do, but I wouldn't have a problem if they held off on investing. And I know, obviously the sooner you get in the market, the better, etc. But like if these guys were buying their first investment property at 32 and 35, after they've already bought a home, they're ahead of 90% of the population. And, hopefully they can buy that second one 2 or 3 years after that, and maybe even a third, 3 to 5 years after that. And they are in, the top sort of 10% of property investors, which really makes them in the top 3 to 4% of people when it comes to investing in property in the country in terms of the number of investment properties.
That's a great way to put it, Dave. In my mind, the only reason why you'd put off investing is because you can see your short-term future commitments from a cash flow obligation point of view will preclude you getting a good asset and holding it. I think looking at your PPOR debt is absolutely a terrible reason to avoid investing. So if they were saying to us, we're not saving for a wedding, we're not saving for going overseas, and we're not having kids, but we're scared about our debt, I would say don't be, and get in there and get started.
That is a really, really good point. And I think what stands out to me is that they are pretty financially responsible. I think they're good savers, right? I mean, they purchased the property with a 10% deposit, and they've now got money sitting in the offset. We don't know exactly how much, but they've obviously proven an ability to save. Maybe they had a lot more savings and could have purchased with a 20% deposit, but wanted to park that in offset as spare capacity. Either way, I think they're very responsible, and they've definitely got that on their side. So I think their ability to do that mathematics and say, okay, well, let's model it out. Let's say we buy an investment property and it costs us $20,000 a year. How long could we eat into that buffer or that safety? And what would it look like if we were down to one income for this amount of period? I think we're on the money with doing that analysis and getting comfortable with, okay, we've got more than enough to cover that, because the best time to invest is today and not after the kids are born.
Yeah. And I think that looking at equity, not just debt, will help this couple going forward. If I'm going to talk about their house in Keysborough and the time that they bought it, I think they timed the market beautifully. They might not have intended to, but in hindsight, I can see that they did. They would have bought in late 23 or early 24, and that market, the Melbourne market, was pretty awful back then. They've got something great. I suspect they've got equity gains already that they've maybe not noticed. And as the market continues to recover and we keep having modest gains, they'll look at their entire big picture soon and see that they've got equity as well. And that might just curb their sense of concern about the level of debt. And as their LVR drops, hopefully that gets them more comfortable with the idea of building a portfolio.
From the question, Dave, it looks like they are aware of their equity, because they've basically said, should the deposit for an investment property be an equity release or from savings from the offset? So, I think you're right there. There's capacity there, Dave. But okay, but Dave, what's the strategy there? Should they be increasing the debt on the PPOR and suffering the higher repayments on that, or should they be using the money from the offset, which is kind of typically the same sort of strategy? It's just one's got a little bit more flexibility and liquidity to it.
Well, yeah, look, you should ideally not be using your savings from your existing offset account, for the simple reason that that will mean you're paying more interest on your home, which is not deductible, and it'll mean you'll be paying less interest on the investment property, which is tax deductible. So therefore, the actual notional interest rate is cheaper when you factor in the tax deductions. So in an ideal world, James, you would be trying to borrow 100% of the investment property plus the costs. So ideally about 106%, 107% when you factor in stamp duty and the other associated costs with purchasing. Now, based on their situation, they're probably not going to have the capacity to do that. Okay, because we know their LVR currently is still at around 90%. All right. Now, having seen thousands of people's numbers like this, you can get a sense of what they've done. So when they've come up with 10% deposit, probably means they've borrowed 95 or 97%, which means they've contributed 3% to the purchase price, and the other 7% has covered stamp duty, etc. Okay, but people call it 10% deposit because that's what they pay the real estate agent when they agree to purchase the property. Okay, so they've probably borrowed, if they've borrowed the 97% or 95% plus the mortgage insurance, they paid $900. Their loan would have been $873,000, and that means if their loan's now $820, they've paid down $50,000. So as you touched on, I'd say they're pretty good savers. You can see that sort of reading between the lines. Even if they borrowed $95,000, that would have been a home loan of 95%. That would have been a home loan of $855,000. So they've paid it down $35,000 in a year or two. Again, knowing what I know, that means they're good savers. They're pretty disciplined. But if that property doesn't grow much, even if it gets to $950,000, they need to get it down to $760,000, that debt. So they need to pay it down another $60,000 just to get to an 80% LVR. Okay, so maybe you could access another 10% against that, but you're going to be paying mortgage insurance for a second time, which you don't want to be doing. So you really need to get your LVR down to about 70% to be able to leverage 10% of the value of the property. Now, Kate's just touched on Keysborough, and the Melbourne market, as we've talked about, is likely to be increasing. So let's say they get some increase in equity and property value over the next year. That property might get up to $1 million, all right, in the next 12 months. So that's worthwhile for them to sort of look at and understand. And if they can get that debt down to $750, let's say over that next year, now that's $70,000. I don't know if that's going to happen, paying down the debt from $820 to $750. But if they're able to do that and the property increased in value to $1 million through natural equity increase, they might have $50,000 to go towards that investment property. Okay, so they might be able to leverage some against the investment property, against the home. But I think, given their timeline, it's going to be tough unless they don't buy that investment property for 2 to 3 years, or maybe even 4 years before they're actually going to have some meaningful equity to tap into to leverage against the home. So hopefully that makes sense. I didn't go too quickly through that, but like that, that's how it plays out. That's how it's going to play out for these guys. I can see it. You can see where they're at, what's happened, what's to come. But in an ideal world, yes, you would leverage against the home and borrow the full amount, because you're going to be using your offset funds. So your actual debt on your home loan interest debt, your real debt on your home loan is going to increase if you take that approach. So there's a potential another reason to maybe look at holding off and reevaluating sort of every 6 months to see if you can actually leverage against the home. I suspect for them to leverage and fully borrow for the investment property, they're going to have to wait 2 to 3 or 4 years to be able to use that equity and borrow the 100 or 106%. Does that make sense?
Yeah, which
it sure
very
does.
possibly puts them smack bang in the middle of their 5-year time horizon too, right, if they're having to wait for that. So it sounds like they are going to need a mix of cash to make it happen.
Yeah, yeah. If they do it, in those probably first few years
Yep.
from now,
So
the next 3 years, yeah.
So rapid fire, maybe if you guys want to say yes or no, in an ideal situation and assuming that they have the confidence to go either way, do we purchase now or wait till we've done the wedding and the children?
I think Dave's highlighted it really well. And if there's not equity there for them to do this purchase, it's quite costly to go in on a very high loan to value ratio for an investment property. And I wouldn't necessarily advise that. I think the important thing for both of them is getting their numbers as highly tuned as they possibly can in relation to childcare and time off work. That will have an enormous bearing. And then they can start modelling out what sort of property they go for. But until they're in a position to go for that property with some equity, I think they've got to treat this time as planning time.
And Dave, you've given us quite a bit to it, but it really, to me, it comes down to understanding the numbers, and if the numbers give them enough certainty and confidence, it's pulling the trigger as soon as possible, right?
That's right. Yeah, pull the trigger as soon as possible if you know the numbers and then you feel like you've got that buffer and runway of savings and surplus cash flow to do it even when you're on the limited income for periods of time, plus the heightened costs of kids. I suspect that they don't have enough equity and savings to make the investment play happen whilst also paying for the wedding and then having that first child and going to a small reduced income. So I suspect when they work through the numbers, that'll just be too tight and there'll be too many reasons why they can't make it work, and probably can't make it work to a price point that makes it worthwhile as well. So I suspect that's what might play out. But if they spend $500 on the wedding like Kate did, and they hold off on the first kid for maybe 3 years, then they probably could act a bit sooner.
Just for
Or hold off on the
context,
first child for 4 years even. But
on this $500 wedding, just so that people aren't thinking that I either had a terrible wedding or I'm not being honest. We just went to the registry office and then out for lunch in Lygon Street with our mates who were signatories. And, each to their own. That suited us down to the ground, but it's not everyone's cup of tea.
Yeah.
yeah,
And
I sort of went the other extreme, I must admit. But I thought, hopefully this is a once-in-a-lifetime event.
so far so good, Dave.
Yeah.
I want to add just some broad context that Dave, I think, tapped into as well. I mean, no one really likes hearing this from an old person, but you're young people. You've got long runways. You're writing into a podcast about property investing at 27 and 30. You've shown an ability to save. You've bought a good property that's going in value. You understand your numbers. Your incomes are well above average. You've got all of the tools to make it happen, whether it's now or whether it is down the track. So I really want to commend you for where you've got to so far. And the decision might be, it is a little bit too much and it's too stressful right now. We are going to wait to tick off some of these life things. I would hate that to be a kick in the guts, a real sort of negative way on starting the exciting things like the wedding and the children and that sort of stuff. You've got plenty of time to secure some financial freedom. If you can do it early, great, but you're already doing much better than most people your age. And I just think with the head screwed on the way it is, you'd be pretty brave to back to go against James and his fiancée.
Yeah, really
Nicely
well
said.
said. And, actually just another piece of advice, I guess, or in terms of my perspective, having having children in my later 30s, although Sarah was 31, I actually think around that 30-year age bracket is a great time to have children, and that's certainly the advice I give people, and I'll give my children as well, particularly when you start doing the maths around how old you're going to be as your kids get older, and wanting to be there for grandkids and all that sort of thing. So there's my 2 cents worth, and I think it's a great time to be having kids as well.
That explains your fitness regimen, Dave. You are getting grandchild fit in advance.
That's right. Yeah.
All right. Well, do we want to have a gold nugget?
Now it's time for us to go mining for our gold nugget property tip of the day.
All right, my gold nugget is a short one. And while they're young and they've got the one property asset in the portfolio, I think they could consider doing a property plan and get some real visibility. They're asking those questions, but when they've got a bit of an idea about the numbers around children, how many days a week do they want to return to work, or how long a break do they want to take, what sort of family support have they got, what schooling are they thinking. Once they've got those numbers, while it's still not a perfect science, you can tweak a property plan. You can update it once you know when your baby's arrival date is. So I think that would be a great investment, so that they've got a much clearer dashboard.
My gold nugget is that James and his fiancée are, by the looks of things, really good with their money management. And so my gold nugget would be simply keep up that habit. Keep up that habit through the children, through the reduced income, and out the other side. Because if you can maintain that good money management, you will and you invest, you will end up setting yourselves up for success into retirement and beyond. And, if you want to leave money for your children and all that. But really, that's what you see holds people back is losing the money management habits that you have often at a younger age, or at different stages of life. So keep up that habit long term, and I think they'll be right as rain.
I love that, and I'm inclined to agree. Knowing the numbers is the key to making the decision, right? Without having that visibility on, okay, here's what it looks like, here's the costs, here's the buffer, here's the cash flow, you really can't make a decision on your risk appetite and what's possible with experts like a strategic mortgage broker as well. But you've got plenty of time, you've got a long runway, and life doesn't always go to plan as well. You need to be able to adapt things. But ideally, the best time to get an investment property would be straight away, but after you've got the visibility on the numbers and you understand the risks. That would be probably my 2-cent gold nugget. But James, congratulations on the state that you've got to already. Sounds like Keysborough is going to do some good work for you in the next little while, and all the best with the wedding, whether it's a Bakos $500 special or one of Dave's Hawthorne East blowouts. We hope you have a great one. And what was it? Yarraville?
Yarra Valley.
Yarra Valley.
Yarra Valley. Oh, la-di-da. Yeah, mustn't have had my address, Dave. But thank you for the question, and we appreciate the question. We hope you got some value from that. Reach out if there's any clarification you need. And if you're listening at home and you've got a question about your investing future and your finances, anything in and around property and property economics, feel free to chuck it through, because we love unpacking these. And we've got another one coming up from Max in the next little while as well. So thank you very much, guys. We'll see you for the next one.
See you for the next one.
See you soon.